When she was 25 years old, she wrote her first novel in 1998, In the City by the Sea. The book was shortlisted for the John Rhys Prize in the UK. Additionally, a year later, she received the Prime Minister's Award for Literature in Pakistan in 1999. Salt and Saffron followed in 2000, her second novel, selected as one of Orange's 21 writers of 21st century. In total, she has about 8 novels and were translated in about 30 languages, a feat that none of us really here can match. Kamila Shamsie grew up in Karachi, a city we come to recognize and understand the underlying issues that it provides for narrating some of her stories. Her undergraduate degree is from Hamilton College, and later she received her MFA from the program for poets and writers at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. I have a problem with a word, too many S's, being half Italian. Amongst her many careers, and I won't go over all of these, just to mention a vice president and fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and professor of creative writing at the University of Manchester. She was one of Granta's best of young British novelists in 2013. Today she lives in London. And her most recent novel, Best of Friends, was published a month ago this year. You should read it. Incredible. I wanted to personally tell you a story about her third novel, Kartography, that appeared in 2002, a novel critically acclaimed and again shortlisted for the John Rhys Prize in the UK. Her work as a novelist was compared to two noteworthy authors from the subcontinent, Arundhati Roy and Salman Rushdie. But I want to add that her cerebral, playful style underscored its own unique quality, one that ventures between anthropology and writing, a style one might describe as ethnography, especially her sensitive and poignant topic of intimate, close-knit society with its own complex gender makeups. Reading Kartography or her last novel, Best of Friends, I am drawn to her fine details regarding family interrelationships, where even class and power will not allow for one to falter on what is expected from one's tradition. Kartography sets the plot with friends growing up in turbulent times in Pakistan, reminiscence of childhood friends, using them to address their own oblivious growing up, allowing the readers to use the background to draw our attention to social and political consequences that touch on their childhood, but also on their innocence. Raheen and Karim grew up insulated from the ethnic violence surrounding them and their families. Tension is ever present in her novels, sociocultural tension regarding the tradition that looms over their heads, activates growing up as citizens, but most important, the influence of their actions to tradition that defines who they are. In 2010, along with 10 Brown senior students, I started the Brown University Chai Masala Reading Club, and our first reading was Kartography. The members were a Bangladeshi, a Pakistani, 3 Americans, 3 South Asians, and myself, Eritrean Italian who lived in the Sudan. We had an exhilarating conversation about the breakup of Pakistan into Pakistan and Bangladesh, 1970, but also that the Chai Masala Club unfortunately did not continue because these are seniors, so some of them went to medical school, law school, and other kinds of graduate work, but from time to time we get on a conversation and we talk about our Chai Masala Club that was inspired by Kartography. Best of Friends, also one can say, centers on the lives of friendship and 2 young girls, one can say inseparable, growing up again in the city, surrounded by familiar structures. They are aware, these 2 young girls, of dangers in parts of Karachi. So we begin to understand a lot more about Karachi as you read some of her novels. The first half of the book or novel grips you. You become the third person in their circle, waiting to read some more pages to find out how they fare in their attempt to break out from tradition or their daily routine. And what transpires is the eventual journey that they do take. The sections where Mariama and Zahra are in a car with two boys driving away from familiar, acceptable social spaces, I found myself talking to them to get out. I was screaming to say, get out of the car, move on. The delicate treatment of gender that Kamila Shamsie style sort of produces is based about questions of freedom versus that of tradition, strict adherence to tradition. But it's also about the concept of honor and shame of one's actions. Truly reminded me of life that I lived in Khartoum in the Sudan, where shame was constantly a step ahead of you as you took the different, you moved in and out of houses. Shamsie's words and style of writing moves you to the point that the boundary between the book, the reader, and the actors become your own setting. You bite your nails, you're worried about the consequences of the impossible outcome, and I felt I was there, bearing also on the onslaught of shame that will be met, forcing decision to these two families to move away from their city. I really recommend this last book for you. So, her talk today reflects the archaeological historian in her. From Greeks to Indo-Greek to Greco-Britains, 2,000 years of Hellenic culture in South Asia. So join me to welcome Kamila Shamsie today to Brown University.
Thank you for that very generous welcome. And thank you for inviting me here, and to all of you who have turned up. It's funny the way the mind of a novelist works. You write a book and you find yourself getting drawn into things that you hadn't thought about much before. And a lot of it ends up in the novel, but an equal amount of the things you've been thinking don't. And then years go by, and then someone says, will you come and do a talk? And then you realize that there are all these thoughts swirling in your head somewhere that you want to do something with, which don't find their space in a novel, but can perhaps find their space in a lecture. So this is sort of offcuts of a couple of novels, as will become clear. Several years ago, I wrote a novel called Home Fire, which was based on the Greek tragedy Antigone. My reasons for rewriting a Greek tragedy were very straightforward. Someone else asked me to do it, and it sounded like a good idea. The someone else was a theatre director, Jatinder Verma, and he wanted me to write a play for his London theatre, Tara Arts. When I said I didn't know how to write a play, he said, yeah, I thought you'd say that. So why don't you rewrite a play that someone else has written, because then that someone else has already done most of the work. And then he said, Greek tragedy is having a real revival these days. Something like Antigone or the Oresteia in a contemporary British Asian context could be interesting. Tara Arts had its origin in British Asian community theatre, which is why he specifically mentioned it as a British Asian story. And as some of you know, in Britain the word Asian tends to mean South Asian. I was at the time a novelist without a novel to work on, which is a tragic state of affair for anyone to be. And I was looking out for the next idea, but no next idea was coming along. So I thought, well, until the next idea comes along, it might be an interesting challenge to try and do a play. So I dutifully went to remind myself of Antigone. In fact, this is the honest way about how the conversation went. He said something like Antigone in a contemporary context could be interesting. And I said, oh yeah, that could be interesting. And inwardly I'm thinking, which one is Antigone? Because it's a terrible thing to admit to professors, but I had studied it as an undergraduate, didn't remember anything. And so literally on the train home, went to Wikipedia to look up plot summary. All things one should never admit in a classroom. But almost immediately, really, even at the point when I was looking at plot summary and before I went back to various translations of it, I saw immediately how this story of 2,500 years ago, Antigone, could be a story of the contemporary London I was living in. I did try imagining it as a play, but as I said, I was a novelist in search of a novel. And I quickly realized I have found my next novel. And so it became Home Fire. Whenever I tell the story, there are always people say, what did the theatre director say? He was actually very nice about the whole thing and gave me an event at his theatre to launch the book. Some of you will know Antigone, some may not. For the moment, all that's necessary to say about it is that my version followed the entwined lives of 5 British characters who are all of Pakistani and Muslim descent. In the year after the book I was published, I did the publicity round, which is to say I went out into the world and talked about the book and answered questions, some of which I had anticipated, some of which I hadn't. One evening at a bookshop in Paris, a man in the audience raised his hand to ask a question that I hadn't anticipated. He said, given that the ancient Greeks are so often held up as the cornerstone of Western civilization, did I have a subversive intention in rewriting one of the classics of Greek tragedy as a story about second and third generation Pakistani Muslim migrants? I could simply have said I had given no thought to any such thing, and that would have been the truth. But I felt a little foolish about having failed to consider the question, which as soon as he mentioned it seemed to me like an obvious question, and so I answered him in a different way, which felt at the time equally true. I said that while, of course, I knew that to many people ancient Greek culture was synonymous with Western civilization, I simply didn't think of it that way, because the Greeks had been a presence in Pakistan for centuries, and so Antigone seemed to me very much a part of Pakistan's inheritance. The answer seemed to go down well with the audience, and I found myself repeating it on 1 or 2 other occasions. But the more I said it, the more I became aware of a disquiet in myself, an uncertainty about whether or not I truly believed my own response. The disquiet came back to me when I was reading a really thoughtful essay written by the critic Boyd Tonkin in response to the publication of Home Fire. Tonkin's essay uses my novel as a starting-off point to talk about the Greek classics and the history of the Indian subcontinent. And he eventually comes to a 2017 production of Antigone in Pakistan, in the northwestern city of Peshawar. He writes, "In one light, we can even view a performance of Sophocles on the northwest frontier not as a transplantation, but a homecoming." I read and then reread that line. On one hand, it was pleasing to find a critic talking about Antigone's relationship to Pakistan in relation to the ancient Greek presence in South Asia. And yet the guardedness of his phrasing, "in one light, we can even view," also struck a chord within that part of me which felt uncertain about the claim to Antigone's appearance in Pakistan as a homecoming. And I was uncertain about it precisely because it was a claim that I had myself been making, and it didn't ever sound quite right to my ears. To explain the context for Tonkin's comment and my own feelings about it, we need to rewind 2,300 years. In what follows, I will be variously using the words Pakistan, Gandhara, Taxila, and India to talk about the same piece of territory, because it is territory that is part of multiple histories and has had many names. I'll also be using Gandhara, Bactria, and Afghanistan to talk about the same piece of territory for the same purposes, for the same reason. One other point of terminology, you'll see it's 2,000 years of Hellenistic culture in South Asia. The word Hellenistic derives from the Greek word for Greece and is used to indicate Greek influence beyond Greece itself, which brings us immediately to the man responsible for spreading Greek influence far beyond Greece, Alexander the Great. Now I get to use a pointy thing very soon. So in 320, and I apologize for those of you, there's some of you in the room for whom I'm going to be repeating all kinds of history you already know, bear with me. For others of you, I promise there will not be a test on any of this. So in 326 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hindu Kush mountains, which run between what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan, and conquered his way just past the river Indus, where his conquests finally ended, his soldiers demanding to be allowed to return home at last. This is Alexander's empire at the time of his death in 323 BCE. So here's the pointy thing, just to give you the... So we go from around here, right, we go from around Greece, we go down towards, all this. That's the River Nile, so that's Egypt, and then all across here, there we have the Hindu Kush Mountains. That is the Indus River, and this is where the empire ends, which is not very far off the sort of contemporary Indo-Pakistan border for anyone trying to get a contemporary stay on that map. So all of this and down there, that's all Alexander. The man died at 33, I mean, ridiculous overachiever. Also important, this is Britain, not part of Alexander's empire. This will become relevant later, all right? So following Alexander's death, the huge empire fragmented. This is 200 BCE. So the Greeks still maintain control over a substantial part of the world. I don't know how well you can see this, but every name that's in blue is part of the Hellenistic world. So it's still under the control of Alexander's generals, but because of their infighting, it's broken up into lots of different kingdoms. So you have the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, Seleucid Empire, that was the largest part of it, which was basically under the control of his general Seleucus Nicator. Greco-Bactria, this is mostly what we now know as Afghanistan, and then Taxila here in, again, what is now Pakistan. So again, it's still much the same area, but it's now broken up into lots of different empires. We move to 100 years later, and the world looks very, very different by now. Greek rule has waned dramatically by now. Again, look for the blue, and you'll find it here. It's sort of around Greece. You'll find some names in blue. The Seleucid Empire has become Seleucia, this little strip here. The Ptolemaic kingdom is still going strong and will until Cleopatra. And then you have this huge area of land where there's now no more Greek rule. And then here, this little cluster, which is Greek rule again, or Hellenistic rule again. These are the Indo-Greek kingdoms. Again, that's the Hindu Kush mountain. So it's Bactria, Taxila, those areas right here. All of this 12, 13, 14, 11. These are all the Indo-Greek kingdoms. The borders of the Indo-Greek kingdoms shifted quite a bit over the years. At some point, there was probably a quite large kingdom comprising much of this territory. At other points, there were smaller kingdoms. The salient feature of the Indo-Greek kingdoms, for the purpose of this lecture, is they were Hellenistic nations, mostly in Pakistan, extending into Afghanistan, and the last of them survived until 10 CE or AD. So that's 336 years after Alexander first crossed the Hindu Kush mountains, right? Over 3 centuries of some form of Greek rule in that area. When I talk of Hellenistic nations, don't think that only the rulers and the armies were Greek. Alexander and his successors established cities that were lived in by Greeks who traveled to the newly conquered lands to fill administrative posts, supply all kinds of expertise, build amphitheaters, and perform plays in them. This last part is not wild speculation. Excavations at Ai Khanum in Afghanistan have revealed a city which has Greek colonnaded households, a gymnasium, and an amphitheater. That's a digital reconstruction of Ai Khanum. Where there were Greeks and an amphitheater, surely there would have been staging of Antigone, but here I'm getting ahead of myself. Suffice to say, Greeks weren't just ruling. There were Greek communities living in South Asia, raising families, making friends, and as the generations went on, recognizing the landscape of Pakistan and Afghanistan as the only landscape of their lives, its fruits their fruit, its sky their sky. I first came across the Indo-Greeks when I was 14 or so, and on a school trip to the Karachi Museum. I remember stopping in amazement in the coin room, reading names that I had never heard of before. Menander, king of Kabul; Dionysus, king of East Punjab; Socrates, king of the Salt Range; and Apollodotus, king of India. These were the names of kings who had ruled in the territory of Pakistan. I'd loved the stories of Greek mythology since Pegasus entered my imagination as a 7-year-old, had felt a particular interest in Alexander the Great because he'd lost his beloved horse Bucephalus in Pakistan. And thanks to having a grandfather who'd studied the classics with great passion during his school days, it wasn't uncommon at family gatherings to hear lines quoted in the original Greek from the Odyssey and the Iliad. It sounds like some real stereotype of how a writer grows up, but I promise that is the truth. The ancient Greeks had been in my life from a very early age, but I'd always thought Alexander was a fleeting moment of Greek contact with Pakistan. And yet here they were in the Karachi Museum, the Greek kings who'd ruled Pakistan. But not just Greek. The coin room identified them as Indo-Greek. What did that mean? What were the stories of those descendants of the Greeks who were at home among the mountains and streams of northwest Pakistan? No one still has very detailed answers to that question because we have so little about the Indo-Greeks, although archaeological work of the last few decades is enhancing our understanding considerably. For a long, long time, almost all we knew about them came from their coins, like the ones that first piqued my interest at 14 and continue to fascinate me. Indo-Greek coins are bilingual, which wasn't true of the earlier Greek coins in India. Here's one of my favorite. That is Agatha Clare. Probably around 100 BC, though some scholars place her even earlier than that. She was possibly the first woman from the Indian subcontinent to have coins struck in her name. She seemed to have ruled as regent to her young son Strato. I have resisted the temptation to go on a long tangent about Agatha Clare and the ways in which you can see from her coins that she tries to position herself as a ruler. And one of them is she has, obviously I'm going off onto the tangent, although I didn't intend to, she has some coins that have a picture of the goddess Athena on the obverse, and Athena looks just like her. And she sort of makes herself out to be this godlike figure. But for the moment, all we have are these. The coin has Greek writing on one side, which translates to "of godlike Queen Agatha Clare," and Kharoshthi script on the other, which says "of King Strato, the Savior, the Just." So that's her son, Strato, who was a young boy, and that's Agatha Clare herself. Here, regent and king take up both sides of the coin, but more commonly, Indo-Greek coins had a Greek deity on the obverse. Here's a silver drachm of King Amyntas, again Greek and Kharoshthi script. Kharoshthi was a script used in present-day northern Pakistan and eastern Afghanistan. It's particularly notable for its figure of Zeus. The king Amyntas liked it enough to issue it as a vast silver coin, which allows us to admire it even more. And that Zeus, and in the palm of his hand is Athena, the goddess Athena, and he's holding a scepter and palm. They're really very lovely, a lot of these coins, and you can get quite lost looking in them. This one only has a Greek script. By 10 CE, the last of the Indo-Greek kings is defeated, or kingdoms is defeated. But by now, Greeks have been living in the area for centuries, and we do have to wonder how long we can continue to call these people Greek, or even Indo-Greek, rather than Indian. For the moment, the point is that the influence of Greek culture and story carries forward well past the end of the Indo-Greek kingdoms, and still exists as material fact in the art of Gandhara. Gandhara, as many of you know, was the ancient name for a region comprising northwest Pakistan and northeast Afghanistan. As you see from the map, it includes present-day Jalalabad, Peshawar, and Taxila. The Indo-Greek kingdoms were all located in this area in Gandhara. Earlier, Alexander had been there, the Persian Empire had been there. Really, anyone who was going to cross into India by land from West or Central Asia or Europe had to come through the Hindu Kush mountains and through Gandhara. It is the most archaeologically astonishing place. We know Gandhara best for the great art that flourished during the period of the Kushan Empire between the 1st and 4th century CE. As you can see, the Kushan Empire was pretty vast. Gandhara is sort of there-ish. That's the Hindu Kush mountains again. And it's the king we know most about from the Kushan Empire was Kanishka I, who ruled from 127 to 150 CE. Again, that's more than 100 years after the end of the Indo-Greek kingdoms, but even so, the coins at the early part of his reign start off with Greek inscriptions, which are eventually replaced by the Bactrian script. And again, Bactria, ancient name for eastern Afghanistan. Kanishka is known for his great patronage of Buddhism, but it's clear that a wealth of religious influences played a role in his life. His early coins have Greek gods. Later, Persian or Zoroastrian deities dominate, but in case you're inclined to see this as a radical shift, it's worth looking at this. These are two coins, that's one, that's another, from the rule of Kushan, of Kanishka. That's the earlier one, that's a later one. Both coins have Kanishka himself in his large boots. You can always know how to identify him because of his large boots. On the top is an early coin with Greek inscriptions identifying the Greek sun god Helios. Later in Kanishka's reign, we have the coin below, with Bactrian inscriptions identifying the Zoroastrian god of light, Mithra. Helios, god of the sun, Mithra, god of light. Not only are the two gods fundamentally the same god, but the Bactrian script itself is a slightly modified version of the Greek script. It's hard to know exactly how to interpret this. Is it Greek culture blending in? Is it forced assimilation and appropriation? Or a complex and shifting mix of the two scenarios, as is so often the case? While we're wondering about that, here's another Kanishka coin featuring the Buddha. There's a strong argument made claiming that the influence of Greek art led to the first known figurative representation of the Buddha in Gandhara in the 1st century AD, some 5 centuries after Buddhism first entered the world. Which is to say, for 5 centuries, the Buddha was represented by symbols such as the wheel, the stupa, the tree. It's only around the 1st century that we see the Buddha represented in human form. Now, here's an example of Greek art. That's the Apollo Belvedere. This is a Roman replica, as so often the case with Greek art, but the original probably dated back to around 330 BC. Again, note the curly hair and the top knot. And you know what's coming next. Here's the Gandhara Buddha, right? It's hard not to make a connection. There we go. Top knot, curly hair. There we are, top knot, curly hair. You don't have to look very hard to find Greek influence in the art of Gandhara. How many people here have ever been to the Peshawar Museum? Oh, I mean, you've got to go to the Peshawar Museum. And so here, well, this is me having been to the Peshawar Museum for all of you. So read the labeling here. Well, if you could, you would. But what it says is, winged, bearded Atlant showing Greek features. The Atlant's a common figure based on Atlas, the Greek god who held up the earth and sky. Atlants are generally found holding up things. We'll get more of that later. In fact, now, such as the stupa in Taxila, the image quality here reminds us of ancient time when camera phones were really rubbish. So I apologize for that. This is one I took in Taxila. But promise me when I tell you that at all these upper levels, you have alcoves with the Buddha sitting in there. That's one example of what they look like. All the upper levels have that, the Buddha everywhere, a repeating pattern. And right at the bottom, at the base, if you could see what was here, it's this, which is an Atlant holding up the Buddha. And I put this on Twitter once. It's sort of one of my favorite images, this idea of Atlas holding up the Buddha. And someone took me to task for it and said, that's not Atlas, that's Yaksha, which is a nature spirit in Buddhism and Hinduism, also known for holding up heavy things. But the thing is about Gandhara, you realize it's possible it is Atlas and it is Yaksha, and the two figures merged and became one in Gandharan art. And that, of course, points to the folly of what I've been doing in the last few minutes, which is trying to separate what is Hellenistic and what isn't in these sculptures. We're prompted to do so by the terminology often used for Gandharan art, which is Greco-Buddhist art, a term coined in 1905 by the Frenchman Alfred Foucher, who is one of the most cited names in early Gandharan studies. The folly of trying to separate Greco from Buddhist became evident to me when I was looking at this figure in the Peshawar Museum. Now, you can say the hair and drapery is Hellenistic and the posture is Indian. You could say that, but why would you want to talk about this work of art as though it's made up of disparate things when it is so harmoniously whole and so perfectly Gandhara? To call it Greco-Buddhist is rather like calling espresso Turco-Italian, because the Turks introduced coffee to Europe, or perhaps Ethiopio-Italian because coffee originated in Ethiopia. It's certainly useful to know the history of coffee. But at the same time, I'm okay with calling espresso Italian. And I'm okay with calling this Gandharan and nothing but. And it's also of all times and all places in what it clearly represents, despite the facelessness of both figures. Just let's look a moment at what's going on. We can't see their faces. We don't know their expressions. And yet I find this incredibly moving. Look, here we have the standing figure has one hand on this man's chest. The other hand is holding onto his arm. And the second seated man has his face turned away. We can see his hair there. He has his face turned away from the standing figure, and he's clutching the back of his head with his own arm. We don't need faces or descriptive text to tell us that this is the need to comfort those we care about when they're afflicted with sorrow, and it's also the impossibility of consolation in moments of deep grief. But you hold on to those you love even when they turn away from you, lost to their own pain. It's an astonishing piece of sculpture, and there is even greater astonishment, as far as I'm concerned, to be found in the Peshawar Museum. Here is the face of the starving Buddha, dated very approximately to the 2nd or 3rd century CE. Again, you might notice the Greek curls and top knots have remained, but the features are very different from the first and probably much earlier face of the Buddha. But stand up close to it, or else crouch upon the ground as I did to bring your face right up to it, and you'll see what's most important is how astonishingly the sculptor has etched sorrow and suffering into that emaciated face and those deep-set eyes. It honestly does make you want to lean your head against the glass case that separates you from it and weep for all the sorrows of the world. This is Gandhara. Here comes one more image of Gandharan art, also from the 2nd to 3rd century CE. There it is, unmistakably, the Trojan horse. How could you imagine the Greeks would come to India and not bring the Iliad with them? What else did they bring from their remarkable literature? Well, it's interesting to speculate about this. I know this is very dark and not terribly easy to see, but I'll try and talk you through this. Excavated from near Peshawar, this terracotta fragment was identified by the early 20th century archaeologist John Marshall as a scene from Antigone. Here's the part of the plot that's necessary to know for the moment. Creon is the tyrant who condemns to death his niece Antigone, who, in addition to being his niece, is engaged to his son Haemon. It's a very desi story. So there's the all-powerful tyrant Creon in the center. There, supplicating him for Antigone's life, is his son Haemon. And he's got an arm around, Creon has an arm around Haemon, in a gesture of protectiveness which is in marked contrast to the fierceness with which he's holding on to Antigone's garments, her face turned up to him in terror. Now, some of you might be thinking this didn't actually happen in Sophocles' Antigone. For those of you who know the play, Antigone is actually led away before Haemon enters the scene. And yet I'm well prepared to believe it could be an artist's dramatic rendering of the complex dynamics between the three characters, or maybe it wasn't. Another classicist, Kurt Weitzman, made a case for this to represent a scene from Euripides, with Heracles as the central character. Everyone agrees, though, that Greek stories made their way into Gandhara. It would make no sense for the Trojan horse to reach there, but not Odysseus or Oedipus, particularly given that amphitheatre at Ai-Khanum. And all this, all these maps and coins and sculptures and this terracotta fragment from near Peshawar, all of this explains why I said in that bookshop in Paris that I think of Antigone as part of Pakistan's inheritance and not just a part of Western culture and civilization. I really do want to be able to embrace that claim wholeheartedly. But despite everything I've said, despite Gandhara, despite the possibility that really is Antigone up there, despite Agatha Clare, despite everything. The truth is that the Greeks are not an inheritance that I can comfortably claim for Pakistan or the Indian subcontinent as a whole. They once were, absolutely. But then the British Empire came to India and created a terrible estrangement, a relationship of opposition between India and the ancient Greeks. Now, here is the central irony of the British Empire. Well, one central irony, I'm sure there are many, but here's one of them. It was an empire that wanted to be enlightened. The period of enlightenment is also the period of empire, and these two things were bound up with each other in all kinds of ways. Being enlightened meant you couldn't simply conquer for the sake of greed and money and power. I mean, of course, that's why you were conquering. And in the case of British India, as we know, all the way from the mid-1600s to 1857, British interests in India were administered by the East India Company rather than the Crown, literally a trading company. So, of course, the motive was profit and power. But you couldn't say that out loud in too many spaces in the era of enlightenment. You had to have a moral justification. You know, in the way that later empires say need to have, we'll put democracy there as a justification for all kinds of imperial expansion. The moral justification of the British Empire was the civilizing mission, or as Kipling came to call it without irony, the white man's burden. The civilizing mission was based on the idea that all people of the world who weren't white were barbarians of some form or the other, and it was the moral duty of the English to shepherd them into civilized ways. In other words, empire didn't exist for the good of the English, but for the good of those who they colonized. Let's be clear, this rhetoric formed no part of the early days of the East India Company. It's as we approach the 1800s that the idea of the civilizing mission really takes hold. Now, here comes the problem. If you're going to sell this idea to anyone, the first thing you need to do is to make sure that places you're colonizing can be claimed as inferior, else they won't need civilizing. And not just inferior or one or two aspects of their lives, but really deeply and profoundly inferior. Allow people just one part of their lives in which they have the upper hand, and you lose your claim to uncontested superiority. The problem was the facts didn't exactly back any of this up. Indian civilization versus British civilization. In the 1900s, 1800s, to look back 1,000, 2,000 years. It couldn't be done, and even the British knew this. It's interesting, they never quite attempt to talk of Indians as savages in quite the ways they did with many other people they encountered who weren't white. They knew about India's ancient civilizations, their philosophy and art and architecture, and I would like to add cuisine, but I don't think that was something the British recognized until deep into the 20th century. But cuisine aside, they knew that they had to find some rhetorical way to get around how sophisticated Indian culture was when compared to anything you'd see with a backward glance at the last couple of thousand of years of British history. It is not coincidental that in the early 1800s, Hellenism started to take deep root among Britain's poets and philosophers and politicians and historians and beyond. Hellenism wasn't merely an appreciation of all things to do with ancient Greek, but was entwined with the claim that the British were the inheritors of ancient Greek civilization. John Stuart Mill famously declared, "The Battle of Marathon, even as an event in British history, is more important than the Battle of Hastings." Let's give some context to that. The Battle of Marathon, fought in 490 BCE, was a victory of the ancient Greek over the ancient Persians, the first of several victories that allowed the Greeks to repulse the expansionist ambition of the Persian Empire. So the argument went that if not for Marathon, Greece would not have developed its golden age, and Hellenic culture plus Athenian democracy would never have existed. So that's the Battle of Marathon. The Battle of Hastings, fought in 1066 CE, in Britain it happened, resulted in a transfer of power in England from the Anglo-Saxons to the Normans, and very dramatically changed the course of English history and the English language. John Stuart Mill's justification for declaring a victory of the ancient Greeks over the ancient Persians as more significant to Britain than the battle that established Norman rule in Britain was as follows. The true ancestors of the European nations are not those from whose blood they are sprung. Let me do that again because it's sort of startling. The true ancestors of the European nations are not those from whose blood they are sprung, but those from whom they derive the richest portion of their inheritance. In other words, the ancestors of Britons were the Greeks, rather than other Britons or even the Romans who had ruled over Britain for nearly 4 centuries. Inheritance was a matter of ideas and influence. The inheritance that the British claimed from the Greeks was partly cultural, partly philosophical, partly political. Athenian democracy represented freedom that the industrial age Britain wished to claim for its moneyed men, while the empires of the ancient Greeks formed a template for expansion. The extent to which the ancient Greeks entered the Victorian imagination can be seen in this statue, which Prince Albert commissioned of himself shortly after his marriage to Queen Victoria. Look at this one here, first of all. There he is in his Greek armor. It was commissioned as a birthday present for his wife, who thought it very beautiful, but she later noted in her diary that it had been moved from Windsor Palace because, and I quote, Albert, thinking the Greek armor with bare legs and feet looked too undressed to place in a room. And so he had another statue commissioned with a longer tunic and gave himself sandals. And this was proudly displayed at Buckingham Palace. There's some room it may still be there. I haven't been invited inside, but if anyone does, please do ask and take a look. The imperial imagination was particularly transfixed by Alexander the Great and his incursions into India. The British saw themselves as his successor, replicating and outdoing him in their conquests. Again, let's stop a moment to consider what the British were doing when they came to India and called themselves the inheritors of Greek civilization. Again, I'm going to say this. The Greeks had never been a presence in Britain in any significant way. The Romans, yes, but the Greeks, no. India, on the other hand, had a Greek presence for centuries, and in the course of those centuries, the Greeks in India had inevitably become Indian. But it was the British who claimed Greece and Greek antiquity for themselves and, crucially, denied any part of it to India. This is where we return to phrases like Indo-Greek and Greco-Buddhist. These were European terms deliberately keeping Greece separate from India. Let's think about the term Indo-Greek, referring to people who'd been in India for over 3 centuries. Imagine if the descendants of those who came over here on the Mayflower in 1620 were still exclusively referred to as Anglo-American and never ever American as late as the 1950s. And when we come to the phrase Greco-Buddhist, there's no India in there at all. This is like calling those Mayflower descendants Anglo-Christian. Greco-Buddhist, a people meet a religion and astonishing art ensues. I said earlier there is a strong argument made claiming that the influence of Hellenistic art led to the first known figurative representations of the Buddha. That argument, made by Faucher the Frenchman and rapidly taken up by English archaeologists in India, was hardly devoid of an element of propaganda. Faucher doesn't just see the Greeks as bringing figurative representations of the Buddha to India, but he extends that to claim that all figurative representation in India stems from the Greeks. This is where a phrase like Greco-Buddhist becomes so significant. It tells us, at the height of European colonization, that the Greeks never became Indian, but were always a European force bringing their superior culture to India and improving it. This is, by the way, still a powerfully felt argument, even though Ananda Coomaraswamy in 1926 presented evidence to show that figurative depictions of the Buddha can be found in Mathura, contemporary to the earliest Buddhist imagery of Gandhara. Gandhara, Mathura. Coomaraswamy's argument was that the 2 Buddhist schools of art in India developed independent of each other at the same time. He wasn't making a claim for the Mathura Buddha to predate the Gandhara Buddha, but the debate rapidly became one of who came first. This was all happening as the nationalist movement was gaining strength in India, strongly resisted by the British. Robert Daniel de Carroll, who's written extensively on the Buddha's image in South Asia, says of the impassioned debate around the subject, "At stake were the very origins of South Asian figural art and the entire legacy of Buddhist imagery. Originator and recipient became highly loaded categories laden with notions of cultural authority and dominance. Scholars such as Foucher, John Marshall, James Ferguson, and others had been trained to see classical Greco-Roman art as the epitome of human creative endeavor and identified their own nations as the inheritor of that tradition." I don't know which came first, or if they developed contemporaneously in regions 800 or 900 kilometers apart. These have both been dated to the 1st century CE. Someone else will have to solve that mystery. Maybe someone has. I don't know everything that goes on in the world. The importance of the ancient Greeks to the colonizers in India spread far beyond questions of archaeology to the question of who was in charge of running the empire. This is India in 1857. The pink portions are British India. The yellow are princely states that were essentially vassals of the British. From the mid-1850s onwards, the administration of British India fell to the Indian Civil Service, or ICS. A position in the ICS was highly sought after and lucrative. And the question of how to determine who should be allowed to enter the ICS was a serious question, and it fell to one Thomas Macaulay, politician, historian, and classicist, to work out the answer to that. Here are some excerpts from Macaulay's report on the Indian Civil Service in 1854, in which he sets out a blueprint for the entrance exam which will funnel British subjects, all men, into the ICS. He writes, "Nor do we think that we should render any service to India by inducing her future rulers to neglect in their earlier years European literature and science for studies especially Indian." I'm going to read that one again because it's also astonishing. "Nor do we think that we should render any service to India by inducing her future rulers to neglect in their earlier years European literature and science for studies especially India." Having nicely dispatched all Indian subject matter as being irrelevant to ruling India, he turns his attention to the question of language. "It seems to us quite clear that those vernacular Indian languages, which are of no value except for the purposes of communicating with natives of India, ought not to be the subject of examination. But we are inclined, though with much distrust of our own judgment, to think that a distinction may properly be made between the vernacular language and two languages which may be called the classical language of India, the Sanskrit and the Arabic." Let me note on the side that although Arabic was certainly used as a religious language among the Muslims of India, Persian had a great claim to being called one of the classical languages of India, given its use in the court of the Mughal Empire and beyond. Macaulay clearly didn't want to elevate the language of India's previous empire, and also perhaps he thought he was replaying the Battle of Marathon by booting out the Persian influence. At any rate, he decides that some questions related to Sanskrit and Arabic should be part of the ICS exam before moving on with some relief. As to the other subject, we speak with more confidence. With great confidence, he naturally says there should be exam sections on English literature and language. And then there's this regarding Latin and Greek. In these two great ancient languages, there ought to be an examination not less severe than those examinations by which the highest classical distinctions are awarded at Oxford and Cambridge. Let me remind you, this is for people to enter the Indian Civil Service, right? At least 6 passages from Greek writing should be set to be translated into English. Of these passages, 1 should be taken from the Homeric poems, 1 from historian of the best age, 1 from some philosopher of the best age, 1 from some Attic orator, and at least 1 from the Attic drama. There she is, Antigone, certainly among the top choices of Attic or Greek drama, helping to choose the men who would rule over India for the British Empire. At the end, Macaulay provides a breakdown of how the exam marks are to be allocated. English language and literature gets 500 points for composition, 500 points for history, and 500 points for literature. Greek gets 750 points and Latin the same. So Greek and Latin together have the same weight as English. Sanskrit and Arabic get a mere 375 points each. It may be no surprise that although the ICS was allegedly open to all British subjects, by the end of the 19th century less than 4% of those in its ranks were Indian. The weightiness given to the classics was an effective barrier to most in terms of both race and class. The classics were largely the preserve of elite British schools. In his books, The Classics in Colonial India, Feroz Vasunia goes into much greater detail about the role of the classics in British India and points out how many of the students who studied the greats went on to join the ICS. The greats was and is the name by which the classics are known at Oxford. It should be no surprise that one of the people who played a role in dreaming up the ICS entrance exam was a man called Benjamin Jowett, Regius Professor of Greek at Balliol College at the University of Oxford and later the Master of Balliol. Jowett was perfectly upfront about saying he was training his students to be just like the guardians of Plato's Republic. They were going to go off and rule India just as the guardians did in Plato's imagined city-state. 3 successive viceroys of India, Lansdowne, Elgin and Curzon, came through Balliol in Jowett's time. Let me return to Macaulay, a particular favourite of mine. His Minute on Education in 1835 was crucial in establishing an English curriculum in Indian schools, displacing all vernacular learning. There's one sentence more quoted than any other from Macaulay's Minute. I have conversed both here and at home with men distinguished by their proficiency in the Eastern tongue. I have never found one among them who could deny that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. Given Macaulay's own passion for the classics, it's perfectly clear that Greek literature is firmly on this shelf of great European literature. Macaulay is in no way an outlier. He is merely a symbol of the British determination to divide the world into binary oppositions, East and West, superior and inferior, colonizer and colonized. These binaries were at the very heart of the British Empire and its civilizing mission. And at the heart of that heart were the ancient Greeks. To the British, they were unequivocally a peoples of the West, despite their centuries in India. And this brings me to my grandfather. Why did he quote Greek onomatopoeias to me at the dining table and offer to read the Iliad in the original to me and offer up his own translation? He was a child of Macaulay, one of the Indian elite who was schooled in England and imbibed the idea that there was no higher civilization than Western civilization. In all the years I heard him talk lovingly, admiringly of the Greeks, I never once heard him express the belief that he might have a connection to them via the history of Pakistan rather than the schooling of England. Athena, Antigone, the Trojan horse, they had all been rendered into figures of empire, indistinguishable from the colonizers. When empire came to an end in India in 1947, the British packed their bags and went home, and in those bags they packed the ancient Greeks who went home with them. Let me return to that moment in the bookstore in Paris. It is true that I was personally very aware of the Hellenistic influence in Pakistan. It was something quite deep in my consciousness. But that hadn't always been the case. In fact, it hadn't even been the case a decade earlier. But prior to writing Home Fire, I'd written a novel called A God in Every Stone, set during the period of the British Raj in India. One of the primary characters is an English archaeologist, a woman who travels to Peshawar in 1915 and is hyper-aware of Greek influences in the city. She even sees Greek gods and heroes in the features of the Peshawari men around her. In writing her, I was of course aware that I was writing about the English colonial gaze, which privileged what was white and Western over what was not. And yet, inevitably, because I was writing her, I was also thinking more than I ever had before about the Greek presence in India. So my answer to the man in the bookshop, which claimed that I saw the Greeks as part of Pakistan's inheritance, was only true because I had been writing about an English colonial archaeologist and seeing Peshawar through her eyes. And even though I was critical of that seeing, it still made me see things I hadn't seen before. That 14-year-old version of me who looked at the coins of the Indo-Greek kings and wondered, who are these Indians who are also Greek? Well, she'd been a 14-year-old who could wonder about something 1 minute and then put it at the back of her mind, where in my case it stayed for the next 25 years or so. I would like to say, but why can't we bypass the colonial gaze and find ways to claim all part of a region's inheritance, including the Hellenistic part? The truth is, it feels facile to talk in those terms. We continue to live in a world that insists on binaries of West and East, white and not white, superior and inferior, civilized and savage. We cannot make our lives ahistorical and claim the Greeks for Pakistan on the basis of 2,000 years ago, as if the last 200 years don't count for much more and aren't still ongoing. It is the ongoing nature we have to contend with. In recent years, the alt-right has discovered a deep appreciation for ancient Greece because of all the myths of white supremacy that have been built for centuries around it. Thank you, John Stuart Mill and Thomas Macaulay and others. It isn't any kind of answer to say to the alt-right, no, in fact, the Greeks were a more significant part of Pakistan than of England or indeed America. You can't accept the terms of their argument and then try to fight from that position. You must simply say no. No to all of it, to the very root of the basis of the argument. In all this, we might do well to remember Antigone, not the symbolic Antigone of Western civilization and binary oppositions, but Antigone the character, the girl herself. Here is what you really need to know about the story in this moment. Antigone was a girl who looked at power and the injustices that flowed from it, and while others around her said, we are powerless, we are afraid, and so we must accept injustice, she said, no. And so I go back to that bookstore in Paris in my mind. I wait for the man to ask his question. He says, given that the ancient Greeks are so often held up as a cornerstone of Western civilization, did I have a subversive intention in rewriting one of the classics of Greek tragedy as a story about second and third generation Pakistani Muslim migrants? This is how I answer him. There are different versions of Antigone. One version of her, the one who appeared in the ICS exam and was placed on Macaulay's shelf of good European literature, is in the grip still of colonizers who turned her into an agent of racist oppression. I have no wish to subvert or reclaim her. I acknowledge she exists. I acknowledge the weight of her existence. And then I say no to her. And when I say no, I invoke the other Antigone, the girl who said no. That Antigone has been adapted into an anti-apartheid figure in South Africa. She is the mothers of the disappeared in Argentina. She is in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. She is in Karachi. She is in Ferguson. It doesn't matter what lands Alexander the Great conquered, or how his generals divided his spoils, or what the King Kanishka did, or how the British established their civilizing mission. Freeing herself of all that, this Antigone ranges through the world, its many languages and histories, saying her defiant no. At home everywhere that there is an audience to receive her. Thank you. Sit here. Sure.
We have two commentators, one from Brown and one from Ohio. Sanya Kamal is an MFA student here at Brown University Literary Arts Department. She writes mostly about imposters, impersonators, catfishes, doppelgangers, lookalikes, and types of chicken. She's from Karachi. I would love to have a conversation with you. I never heard of any of these. Shazia Rahman is Associate Professor of English, specializing in post-colonial literature at the University of Dayton. Her research and teaching emerges from intersecting interests in global gender environmental issues. She's the author of Place and Postcolonial Ecofeminism, Pakistani Women's Literary and Cinematic Fictions. Her work has also appeared in journals such as South Asian Review, Journal of Postcolonial Writing, Interdisciplinary Study of Literature and Environment, and Environmental Communication. These are the two commentators They will all have 10 minutes, and then we open it up for discussion. But unfortunately, we have to leave this room 5 minutes before 4, because something else takes place. So, you want to start?
Sure.
You can sit here if you want.
Oh,
Or you can, whatever,
whichever.
whatever it is.
Thank you for saying my bio, or trying to say my bio with a straight face. Thank you so much, Kamila, for the lecture. It made me think so much about things that I hadn't thought about Pakistan's history. And also just some of the thoughts that kept coming into my mind were about the man in the bookstore and the two Antigones that you invoked in the end. But before I begin my comment properly, I want to start with a bit of a digression. When you're a child, there's this thing older relatives do, is that they will ask you a question every time you meet them. And it's the same question. And ostensibly, it is this question about, it's supposed to be about how you're doing, how you're growing up into a responsible adult. On my mother's side of the family, this question, when I was around 10 or 11, it was always, have you started praying namaz yet? On my dad's side of the family, this question was, what are you reading? The person who would ask this question the most on my dad's side of the family was my grandmother. She loved to read, I loved to read, but we were never reading the same things. So we always were sort of talking past each other about the books we were reading. She wouldn't read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and I had tried and abandoned Gone with the Wind. So that was how our conversations usually went. But one time, I went to visit her house, and she asked me the question, what are you reading? And I said, I'm reading a book called Salt and Saffron. And she pointed to her coffee table, and she was reading Kartography. And so Kamila Shamsie's writing was sort of this confluence around which my grandmother and I began to really connect over our love of books. The idea of the confluence makes me think of a movement that frequently emerges in Kamila's writing. Characters with otherwise diverging lives meet by a curve of circumstance and flow towards each other. Lives are braided together over decades and generations with the ebb and flow of love and hostility. Moments of tenderness are bisected by moments of betrayal. There is an elegant fluidity in the way Kamila Shamsie writes her characters, with grace when they are vicious, with clarity when they are self-indulgent. She carries them over chasms and collisions effortlessly, like running water. When thinking about this lecture, the word confluence came again to my mind with the image of the emaciated Gandhara Buddha. As Kamila said, hair and drapery, Hellenistic, posture Indian, or with the regular Gandhara Buddha, sorry. Hair and drapery Hellenistic, posture Indian, and these two streams of influence joined in a beautiful harmony. But the result is also more than the sum of its parts, and I share her frustration with this fixation on reducing the artwork down to its discrete components, and I think this keeps us from experiencing it as an aesthetic whole. There's a problem in breaking an artwork into content and form, as Sontag says in her essay Against Interpretation. According to Sontag, the problem in our way of thinking about art is also an inheritance from Plato and Aristotle. The alternative, she proposes, is that instead of a hermeneutics of art, we need an erotics of art, which means that the foremost experience of art should be aesthetic pleasure. As Kamila said of the emaciated Buddha, it is incredible because it makes you want to weep. I wondered if it was this emphasis on interpretation of the man in the bookstore that kept coming in my mind and made me quite annoyed at his question. The way that question was framed made the Antigone of Homefire feel like a subset of the Antigone of Sophocles. She feels hyphenated in the way Indo-Greek or Greco-Buddhist are hyphenated. The hyphen is this way of thinking that doesn't allow her to be fully a work of art on her own. But I think there was more to that in my annoyance with that question. It was the use of subvert. Is Homefire a subversion of Antigone? My instinctive answer is no. And it's the kind of emotional no that brings its own flurry of questions. Was this man racist? What were his politics? Was he familiar with Antigone? Had he even read Home Fire? Or was it simply the case that he used the word without thinking too much about precision and connotation? There was something about the implication that Home Fire was a subversion of Antigone because the characters were British Pakistani Muslims, as if there was something inherently vile and corruptive about their identities that would automatically subvert whatever they touched. But not knowing anything about this man or his intentions, I think it would be better to put him aside and think about this question on its own terms, in the way that it appears in this essay as a catalyst, as a catalyst for this lecture. Is Home Fire a subversion of Antigone? Again, my first thought is to say no. Like Sophocles, Kamila's Antigone has the justice-seeking heroine, the inflexible tyrant, the reluctant sister, and the crushed son. The adaptation stays true to the original's values, and the tensions between the characters and the arcs of the most integral events play out as expected. So I think this, and I have to pause here because my assumptions begin to glare at me. What are the true values of Antigone, and what is most integral to it? How does the answer change for different people and different positionalities? Here I must quickly confess to something slightly embarrassing, but because of Kamila's earlier confession, I feel less bad. When I first started reading Home Fire, I missed the play on words with the names of the characters, and as I was reading the first section, which is from the point of view of the older sister, Isma, I thought this was Antigone, and I thought this because I had easily identified Karamat as the tyrant, because Isma's character resented him. I assumed this friction would later develop into full-blown opposition. I was wrong. But I think there's something interesting here in the way, as an answer to the question I posed earlier about what are the true values of Antigone. I was able to identify the tyrant because my political beliefs align with the novels. We agree on what injustice looks like, and so when we see it, we identify the person creating it as the tyrant, the person in opposition to him as Antigone, and the rest of the characters fall into place. This would look very different through the eyes of someone on the political right. To them, it might seem not even a subversion of Antigone, but a perversion. And it would look very different from the eyes of the kinds of politicians who call for the revoking of British citizenship of people like Pervez in the novel. It makes me wonder, can the state even see itself as crayon? And when people like Macaulay use Antigone in the Indian Civil Service exam, how do they resolve for themselves the element of justice so prevalent in the play? For people like Macaulay who align themselves with the conquering ambition of Alexander, ancient Greek culture becomes important because of Alexander's empire. Their Antigone is a great work of art because she is written by Sophocles, and Sophocles was an eminent playwright in ancient Greece, and that was the culture Alexander emerged from. Antigone's artistic value trickles in by association to an imperial history. She becomes, for them, a symbol to be paraded out. She becomes a passage to be translated. She becomes a product of greatness, and in becoming all of these interpretations, she loses some aesthetic quality. I said earlier that I identified Antigone by the web of relations and by her role in the plot. But a set of events doesn't make Antigone art. It is the quality of aesthetic pleasure it evokes. There was a moment in the novel when Pervez was trying to escape a situation where I felt genuine terror and worry for him, and I felt this even though I knew how the story had to unfold. Aesthetic pleasure, the kind that Sontag talked about, is found in these moments where time becomes suspended. Each time Antigone is adapted, each time she moves the reader or viewer or audience member, she collapses the distance between the time she was written 2,000 years ago and the present. And she can only move the reader in this way when she can speak to something that feels true to the here and now. This is how great works of art transcend time and become timeless. The Antigone of Macaulay, of the British Empire, of the Nazis, of the alt-right, can never collapse time this way. For her to remain linked to ancient Greek culture and to Alexander, 2,000 years of history always have to stand in her way. She functions not as an art object, but as an object of history. This Antigone isn't alive, but fossilized, and she remains fossilized as long as she remains in the hands of power. And so to ask again, is home fire a subversion of the classic Antigone? Yes, probably, but she's also a reanimation and a restoration of it to art. Thank you.
Thanks so much to Shahzad Bashir and the Saxena Center for Contemporary South Asia at Brown for this generous invitation. I want to begin by saying what an honor it is to be here to comment on Kamila Shamsie's brilliant exploration of our world history, how it has unfolded, and where we all need to stand in the face of power and racist oppression. I, too, was a child and then a teenager returning to the Lahore Museum in Pakistan again and again, staring at those coins, wondering what they meant. And I so really appreciate you, Kamila, for helping me understand that history as well as its implications for our current moment. I do think you are right that we, Pakistanis, gain nothing by telling the alt-right that the Greeks were a more significant part of Pakistan than of England. That kind of chauvinism gets us nothing. In fact, we have to fight it wherever it occurs, in whatever form it occurs. Nonetheless, I personally am grateful to have learned about this and wish that this history were more widely known. In fact, I would argue that one of the things Kamila does best is present us with histories to illuminate, educate, and inspire. I think her presentation today is an example of that. And her novels provide us with fictional stories that relate to forgotten histories and help us connect the dots between our past and our present. I was asked today to talk a little about the influence and reach of Kamila Shamsie's work in the context of Pakistan, but as you've heard, her writing reverberates far beyond Pakistan as well. What I want to focus on is how history works within her fiction. Kamila has mentioned both her 2014 novel, A God in Every Stone, which is set in World War I, and her 2017 novel, Home Fire, which is set today, but somehow connects us with the ancient Greeks. If you listen to the mainstream press, reviewers and so on, they'll tell you that Home Fire was really the game changer for her as a writer. A lot of people really started paying attention to Shamsie after she wrote Home Fire for many reasons, including the fact that it is a rewriting of Antigone. So many people find that fascinating because of the two Antigones that we just heard about. Also, Home Fire is about a sweet young man who becomes radicalized enough to join ISIS, and as we read, we're able to understand how that might happen. That situation feels a lot less foreign after you read the novel, and so many people appreciate Home Fire for that reason, including me. I have nothing but good things to say about Home Fire. It is, in fact, beautifully written. However, if we consider all of Kamila's novels within the larger context of Pakistani literature, I really think we have to begin by giving her 2002 novel, Kartography, its due, as Lena would agree, I'm sure. As a Pakistani who pays attention to Pakistani literature and history and culture and all of that, I would argue that her third novel, Kartography, was the real game changer for those of us growing up in the silence surrounding the war of 1971. And for those of you who don't know, 1971 was the partition of Pakistan, which came after the 1947 partition of British India, which is the one that you've probably already heard of. In 71, there was a civil war that came out of genocide committed by the Pakistani military against its own population of Bengali Pakistani citizens. There were mass killings, mass rapes, mass displacement of people fleeing into India, which then fought a war alongside Bengali Pakistanis against the Pakistani military, which then resulted in the independent nation state of Bangladesh. This doesn't just happen. People of one ethnicity do not just start killing and raping people of another ethnicity unless the seeds have already been sown via forms of discrimination, various discourses of hate that circulate and become acceptable in mainstream society. And what Kamila Shamsie did for us was show us how this happens. Kartography is the first Pakistani English language novel on the 71 war. That in itself is significant. But even more important was what Kamila Shamsie did in her novel, which was to show us how the mainstreaming of discrimination and hate works in Pakistani society from a Pakistani perspective. She shows us the effects on families, on children, on friendships. For me, this novel was helpful and also haunting. So I want to share with you these words from the novel that have stayed with me after all these years. And I quote, "We should not have kept our name. Pakistan died in 1971. It was a country with a majority Bengali population and all its attendant richness of culture, history, language, topography, climate, clothing, everything. How can Pakistan still be when all of that, everything that East Pakistan added to the country, is gone? How can Pakistan still be when the whole is gone and we are left with a part? We should have recognized that the Pakistan of dreams died and was buried in the battlefields of 71. End quote. Honestly, I'm so grateful for these powerful and moving words that Kamila Shamsie has given us. By writing Kartography, she forced us to look at what we did. I think it was a reckoning for us, and of course that reckoning is and should be ongoing. And I should also mention that in that novel, Shamsie connected the ethnically motivated Pakistani on Pakistani violence of 1971 with the similar violence in Karachi in the 1980s and 1990s. That linkage is really the hallmark of what Shamsie does in her work. She uses history to reframe how we think about our present. And if you know my work, then you know that I wrote a book about Pakistani women novelists and filmmakers, and that one of the chapters of my book is devoted to Kamila's fifth novel, Burnt Shadows. When people find out that I'm an English professor, there's often a moment when they want to know, what is my favorite novel? Or what novel would I recommend if I could only pick one? Since 2009, I have insisted that everyone just read Shamsie's Burnt Shadows. I have taught it in classes on Pakistani literature, but frankly, I also teach it in my Asian American literature class because it very helpfully provides a context and a backstory for 9/11 while simultaneously helping us, what happened to my, I don't know what happened. Engage with issues surrounding war and violence, human trafficking, racism, and so much more. And again, what Shamsie does best in that novel and in what she did today is help us see our present world through the past. So to return to 9/11 then, other writers, Pakistani and not, have written their own 9/11 novels, but Burnt Shadows is much better, I would argue, because it links 9/11 with the bombing of Nagasaki, with the war in Afghanistan. It follows a woman protagonist, and it helps an eco-feminist like me talk about environmental impacts with my students on a global scale. The novel covers a lot of ground spatially, moving from Japan to India, Turkey, Pakistan, the US, Afghanistan, Iran, and so on. It also covers a lot of historical ground because it moves from World War II to the 1980s to post-9/11 North America. And so to me, this is yet another important gift that Kamila Shamsie has given the world. Pakistani literature is now something to contend with, something we can't ignore. Shamsie's novels are at once local in their attention to place and simultaneously global in the breadth of her vision. Here is how a Japanese protagonist, Hiroko, describes Nagasaki during World War II, and I quote, "Functional. Hiroko Tanaka thinks, if there were an adjective to best describe how war has changed Nagasaki, she decides, that would be it. Everything distilled or distorted into its most functional form. She walked past the vegetable patches and saw the earth itself, furrowing in mystification. Why potatoes where once there were azaleas? How to explain to the earth that it was more functional as a vegetable patch than a flower garden, just as factories were more functional than schools, and boys were more functional as weapons than as humans, end quote. This depiction of World War II in Japan is exactly still the world we live in today, because we live in a world of perpetual war that requires that boys become weapons rather than humans. These particular words were very impactful for me when I first read this novel, because my own son, at that time, was only 6 years old. And I remember looking at him and thinking about the world he was now living in and wondering about the social and environmental effects of ongoing war. Shamsie's words have the power to do that in Pakistan and beyond. I think this ongoing pandemic is showing us how much we need art in our lives to comfort us and also to help us think about our world and our place in it. And so much of the news is so bad that sometimes the work we all do feels meaningless because of the ubiquity of violence on so many levels. And what can we do, we ask, in the face of such huge problems? Well, I look at what Kamila Shamsie writes, not just her fiction, but also her nonfiction. I look at both for her insights. In 2009, she published her nonfiction book, Offense, The Muslim Case. When there were protests at the American Cultural Center in Islamabad, Pakistan in 1989, after Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses was published, Shamsie asked, the author of the book was not American. The original publishers of the book were not American. Why then target the American Cultural Center? End quote. In fact, we were all wondering how to make sense of our world. But Shamsie's slim volume showed us how national politics and history can explain much more about the protests than religious ideology. When Salman Rushdie was stabbed last August, I remember returning to Shamsie's words for help, and I hope that you do too. We're lucky to have Kamila Shamsie in our midst today. Thank you.
We open it now for questions. There, I not saying no to you, Ashu? Okay, go ahead.
Have the microphone?
Oh. Speak loudly.
Tracing the.
Here you go, Asher.
Thanks. Tracing the Hellenic links of Pakistan in such marvelously plausible detail is a stunning intellectual move and a move of stunning originality. Thank you for presenting it here. I was not aware. I had some idea of Alexander, of Takshila and Gandhara, but the etching of those details was most impressive. I have 3 comments to make. One is about Greece as the foundation of Western culture, or Greek culture as the foundation of Western culture. One of my closest friends is Stathis Kalibas. Has the highest share of political science at Oxford now. And I've taught at his summer school in Olympia for 2 weeks. The lecture he gave to our students there was linked with his childhood, when he would go from Athens to Paris. His parents would say, "You are going to the West. You're going to the West." And then there's a chapter on this in his book called Modern Greece. And he would wondered, in his later years when he studied the argument that Greece was the foundation of Western culture, historically, he said, "But I have always heard that we were part of the Middle East." And we from Turkey or Greece went to Paris. When we went to Paris, we went to the West. So, at least one chapter, perhaps two chapters of the book on modern Greece deal with this problem. How Western is Greece? I just thought I would call your attention to it. He is a truly arresting mind, a political scientist, but can go into very imaginative humanistic directions in his work. Point number 2, John Stuart Mill has been an object of great fascination for me for the last 7-8 years now, for 2 reasons. One is the book, The Rhetoric of English India, I think, by the scholar who wrote Meatless Days.
Sara Soleri.
Yes. And then a book by Uday Mehta called Liberalism and Its Connection with Colonialism. And John Stuart Mill and his father play a very central role there. John Stuart Mill's gaze is colonial, to be sure, but it's not racist. Because he reserves the same words and same assessment for the Welshmen, for the Scots, for French peasants in Brittany as opposed to Parisian people. He does not want the poor of England to get the right to vote or to be called equals of those who have property or those educated. Right? This vision is basically mid-19th century liberalism, which pays a lot of attention to being educated and being propertied. And everyone else who's not educated, not propertied, belongs to an inferior culture, whether it's India or it's Wales or Scotland. He himself is Scottish, incidentally, while he's writing all this. I just went through some of what I wrote. I can read that out to you. But it's a colonial gaze, not a racist gaze, is the point I want to make. Third, precisely in the Rhetoric of English India, and then Uday Mehta's work, there's a figure called Edmund Burke, who intervenes between the 1757 capture of Bengal by East India Company and the rise of John Stuart Mill much later in 1830. Macaulay in 1830s, John Stuart Mill in 1840s and 50s, and John Stuart Mill's father, James Mill, in 18-teens. The idea of a civilizing mission, he argues, and I want to see how you would react to it. In this very impressive book, Uday Mehta, as well as earlier Sara Soleri, argue the idea of a civilizing mission of the English begins in 18-teens. The English are struggling for the first 50 years about how to understand India, its culture, etc. And Edmund Burke has 8.5 volumes of his overall 12 volumes on India. These are speeches to House of Commons and during the impeachment of Warren Hastings. And I read out quite a lot of that to my class. He is very seriously appreciative of the richness of Indian history and culture. And his attack on Hastings, the impeachment of Hastings, is because Hastings did not understand how civilizationally superior, he uses the term, India was. Right? So this birth of civilizing mission, according to these arguments, is with James Mill's History of British India in 1816 or 1817. An unsophisticated father of a somewhat more sophisticated John Stuart Mill. So I'll stop there and want to see how you react to these.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for a stunningly original lecture.
Thank you. Shall we take one more question? Is that what you raising your hands for?
For a question?
Yeah?
Yeah. Is that a
Okay.
question and comments?
Okay.
I did think that's why we raised my hands, but I wasn't sure. I would raise my hand just to, clap, raise my hand, bow my head, everything, because this was amazing, and thank you so much for sharing this. I was a huge fan of the work before, and now I'm a huge fan of you. I had 2 comments. One was actually, and thank you also to our commentators, the quote that you read out from Kartography, just kind of, so these are really not questions, but just kind of comments. The first was this idea that, you know, Pakistan should not have been called Pakistan after the kind of separation and the way in which, of course, the separation occurred of Bangladesh. And it brings me back always, and I thought of you, Leena, you know, because you work on Bengal, about the fact that the Indian, I've written a book about subnationalism and regionalism in India, and it always gets me back to this point that the state of West Bengal has refused to call itself anything but West Bengal, even though there is no East Bengal. And so the idea that it's the West to what? And that has been since 1947. And so in my book, I talk a lot about the kind of language movements and linguistic regionalism that led to the redrawing of India's federal map. And India is it's a linguistic federation. Most boundaries of most states reflect independent languages and the demands for them as such. And so the fact that the kind of West Bengal state refused to call itself Bengal, which would make sense because, you know, at that point there was Bangladesh, and has actually actively refuted, you know, things like, you know, moves to do this is to me quite significant. And the fact, of course, that it's not coincidental, and this leads to my second point, that it's one of the few states in India today that is not ruled by the BJP. And so it's interesting, you know, this point about what is the part, what is the whole, what does it mean to continue to call yourself something even when, in a way, the whole is gone. But what does it mean to continue to call yourself something when there is, you know, so that kind of retention just kind of spots something for me there. And also, uninterestingly, when you think about eco kind of feminism, the fact that that state of West Bengal has refused to acknowledge the state of Gorkhaland. And so, you know, there's something there by which it kind of names itself, and it has two official languages. And so in some ways, you think of Bengali subnationalism and Bengali culture and Bengali regionalism, but this is also a state that actually, unlike most other states in India, you would think that Bengal has one official language, right? It's Bengali. No, actually, it's always had two. It's Nepali and Bengali, and the Nepali kind of harkens back to the fact that the state of Bengal kind of narrows itself into Gorkhaland, adjacent to Nepal, and has sometimes violently denied them their own kind of whole. And so I just, you know, I thought as a political scientist, you know, that kind of, I've read Kartography, but thank you so much for pulling out that quote. And, you know, the second point, which is related to this, again, as a political scientist, I kind of think about the civil service and about socialization. And so schools and civil service exams are very important for political scientists because these are sites of socialization. They're sites of creating citizens in the case of schools and for creating the servants of the nation in the case of civil service exams. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about what is and what is not included in civil service exams. And my new book kind of looks at China and India and the contrast between Confucianism as a Confucian civil service exam and what Indians were taught or not taught. And so to me it's interesting because, you know, your kind of really amazing reflections today make me realize that not only did the British, particularly in the form of Macaulay and the civil service, cut us off from our own Hellenic past, but they also propelled us into our Hindutva futures. Because in not only telling us that the Greek inheritance was their inheritance, they also, as you pointed out, cut us off from our vernaculars. And it was in the claiming and championing of our vernaculars that the Hindu right has arisen. Because those ICS you know, civil servants and their, you know, descendants of whom, you know, my father was is an IAS officer. And so it's that is that kind of Nehruvian elite, that the kind of RSS and the BJP and the Sangh Parivar has kind of so effectively rebelled and built their base on. And so I just kept thinking, you know, yes, you know, they cut us off from our past and they pushed us into this kind of future that we live in today. So as I said, no comments, but just to say, as always, this is just so nourishing and thought-provoking, so thank you.
I think we'll let her answer these two questions and then see
Well, I don't know, there's a lot for me to answer beyond to say thank you to you both for what you've added. I will say that there are plenty of Welsh, Irish and Scottish people who'll say, of course, the English are racist towards us. But I do think it is very interesting how that the civilizing mission is not something that's always there, and that there is a point where, you know, and that there are very different and contested versions of how England is going to deal with India, and then at a certain point the civilizing mission gathers force and steam. And I think that's a fascinating history in the way that that really takes shape. And then things like certainly the literature, I mean, of course, I'm interested in the literatures of a place and how literature and poetry and philosophy and discussion and what you think is this very kind of, aesthetic conversation about Greek art all become in service to this thing. It's a powerful reminder of how what we think of as being conversations in the aesthetic realm are deeply, deeply political and politicized. So thank you for that, and thank you for your comments as well. I mean, I do think it's when you put together paper like this, one of the things, I kept thinking, how do I refer? Am I saying Pakistan? Am I saying the area we now know as Pakistan? Am I saying India, the Indian subcontinent, Gandhara, Taxila? Because you do just realize that the nation state itself and that singular name doesn't make any sense, is the truth of it. And you have to, that the extent of mythologizing, but also of things you have to leave out. I mean, the fact that India and Pakistan are trying to create distinct histories from each other is one of the more bizarre things that the human brain has ever tried to do, really. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I just have, oh, sorry. I have a sort of question that I haven't quite articulated yet, so
Right.
it's taking shape. But I really liked when you showed like kind of the hybridization of Atlas and Yaksha, and I kind of want to ask you a question about sort of representation as a writer, and specifically given your movement across visual material, about kind of figurative versus embodied representation. Obviously, the hybridized identity is something that has been written about and theorized in post-colonial literature for years now. And so obviously that's something that's of particular relevance in, let's say, Home Fire, when you're thinking about the British Asian context, as you mentioned. But I guess I wanted to ask you about the climax of that novel, and therefore of Antigone as well, which is the burial of the body itself. And to maybe draw you out a little bit on the kind of place of embodiment in representation, and especially when it comes to the context of British politics, about the question of race, and whether you approach that kind of representation politics through the body of the, let's say, second, third generation, or whether you're thinking about that in discursive terms of figurative representation of what that kind of Britishness means. I don't know if that quite coheres, but I guess I'm interested in this sort of hybrid figure and the place of the body in it specifically.
I mean, in an odd way, I would say that would be more a question for you reading the text than me writing the text. I mean, the thing is, the novelist's brain works in this very peculiar way that the kinds of questions I'm asking is, how do I get this character to meet this character?
Yeah.
Which is not, and this is not to say that it's not a good question. It's that so much of, it's when I'm doing conversations and then people ask me questions like that, I think so much of that stuff is back of the brain stuff. Which is not the thing I'm thinking of when I'm writing the novel. It's the thing I'm thinking of in the 15 years prior to writing the novel that is somewhere deep down, which is the soil from which the novel grows. Yeah. And I'm not particularly good at looking at the soil and dissecting it. I know it's there. But I know that with, and I don't know if this is going to answer the question, but with Home Fire, a book comes out in the world and people say very nice things about it, and even when they're saying nice things, you're looking and thinking, yeah, but don't say that. And one of the things is when the conversation on the book was about how, here's this boy and he's torn between his religion and his nation. And I'm thinking, he really isn't. At no point in the novel is he torn between his religion and his nation. What he's torn about is the nation he lives in doesn't think he belongs there. And the nation he lives in has treated people of his religion as though they are second class. So that it's not, that British Asian distinction is not embodied in him. It's embodied in the state. And he's responding to it rather than being it. I don't know if that answers the question at all, but that was sort of part of what I was thinking of. And yet when you actually start the novel, it's who's this guy, what does he like to do in his free time? But all the weight of this other stuff, when the 7/7 bombings happened in London, I did a Google search to look for term British terrorists. And of course, it didn't exist. And this was 2005, and I was really interested in the terminology they were using about these boys who were young men, born and raised in Britain, had never lived anywhere else, not ever. And it was a fascinating series of terms. So a lot was British Muslim or British Pakistani, but the more right-wing newspapers were using formulations like British passport holders, as if there's something. And it was right after all that the government, in fact, it was a Labour government, said we started talking a lot about Britishness and how in order to become a citizen, you have to pass a Britishness test and all these kinds of things. And so it was very much that book coming out of my being a very recent migrant to Britain at this moment where the state itself and the media, particularly the right-wing, but not only the right-wing media, was saying, these are two separate things, British and Muslim, and that being British is not actually about what your citizenship is or what your passport is. It's some other ephemeral thing that we will define depending on how you behave. So that's what I think a lot of that came out of.
Okay. Any question? Yes. Yes, sorry, I couldn't see you.
I should.
Great, thank you very much. So first of all, great appreciation for the talk and I think the responses brought out so many of the things that have been so evocative in reading your work. I want to ask a question about actually in a very different direction than what we've been talking about, which has to do with the question of language. And so the two very interesting issues with respect to people who live in multiple languages but write in one kind of bring this to mind. One is once talking to Orhan Pamuk, he was asked what he thought of the translations of his work into English, and he said, "I don't care, they're not my work." Like he refused absolutely to acknowledge that anything that was published in English was his work, that the only thing that was his was in Turkish. In a different conversation with Mohsen Hamid.
Never believe what writers say, by the way.
Sure. There's that. I mean, I think there was a very deliberate kind of performance that he was doing. And talking to Mohsen Hamid many years ago when The Reluctant Fundamentalist first came out, and the idea, and then because it had been translated into many languages, so someone asked him, well, has it been translated into Urdu? And his first reaction was, it can't be translated into Urdu. Then he said, it can be translated to Punjabi. It has been translated into Urdu. So, but again, there was the question of language, where the author, who clearly lived in multiple languages, but their voice coming from the language in which they wrote, they seemed to stand in an interesting tension, or the whole question was very interesting to me. So I'm just wondering, very kind of an open-ended way, as to how you think about any of these questions, or even you deploy non-English very, very sparingly as compared to some other. So I'm just very curious as to the process.
I mean, I'd love the books to be translated in Urdu. If anyone here feels like doing it, go right ahead. Here's a story. Some years ago, a friend of mine, an English friend, called me up, since Kartography has arisen in this room. And she said, I've just had a big fight with my boyfriend about you. And I said, I haven't met your boyfriend. Her boyfriend was an Italian bookseller. And she said, we've just argued about who dies at the end of Kartography. So who does? And I said, this person. And she said, I'm right. I'm calling him back. Then 10 minutes later, she called me and she said, I think you may want to sit down. And I said, why? She said, well, I called my boyfriend. And he said, read me the last page. And so she said, so I read him the last page. And he said, well, in English, you're right, but in Italian, I'm right. So he claimed that in the Italian version, the hero Karim dies on the last page. And I was delighted by this. I mean, I told my publishers and my agent, who said, we have to speak to the Italian translation and get them to change it. I thought it completely wonderful that there was this whole other version in which this thing which I had briefly considered happening in the novel went and happened in Italian. The Italian publishers, I should say, when contacted, said, we are perfectly clear in who dies at the end. It's true that there's a pronoun that, people may read one way or the other, so there may be some confusion. But it is fascinating. I mean, my approach to the idea of translation is I'm very glad it exists, but it's also an odd thing, this idea that I don't read any of the languages in which, so when, for instance, Burnt Shadows was a bestseller in Norway for months and months, and I just thought, I don't know, maybe the Norwegian translator is a better writer than I am. I have no idea what's going on with any of this. And so it's you have an odd relationship. I mean, I don't for a second believe Orhan's line about not caring about his English translations, because he reads English and he would care. But it is this thing where your books are going out in these very different contexts. And it also is an interesting one because people love to ask writers that question of who is your audience, and I don't know, because the books actually do end up existing not just with audiences I don't imagine, but in actual languages I don't know. And if you write a language is the very base of what you're doing. So it is and it isn't as if a painting were to become, I don't know, a sculpture. But it isn't that, of course, because it's still being a novel. There's another question of how language works in books, and how you're going to depict language. I think with the earlier books, I do a little more of taking maybe an Urdu phrase and translating it, or having a word in Urdu. And that started at some point to feel unsatisfying to me as well, because it sort of announces its foreignness in a way that isn't natural to the way people are speaking it. And then I wrote Burnt Shadows, and Burnt Shadows starts in Nagasaki, and you have people speaking Japanese, except I'm writing it in English. And then you have people speaking German, and I'm writing it in English. And then you have people speaking Urdu, and I'm writing it in English. And I thought, I can't do the Urdu any differently. I can't, having done the German and Japanese as I'm just writing the standard English dialogue. It's wholly inconsistent within the book to write Urdu and English in any different way and try to get some elements of Urdu. And it just, something just switched in my brain, because with that book, it wouldn't have made sense. And so largely what I do is, and what I find interesting is to have characters who are, whatever language they're speaking, the way in which I'm rendering it on the page, their language and syntax is similar, and what you're getting of difference is the things they're saying, how they're saying it, what they're choosing to say or not say. But it is, it's a very problematic one, and I don't think anyone has a good answer to it unless all your readers have access to all the languages of all the characters.
Thank you. I think at this point we move on to the next room. There is a reception there for us, because another talk is coming here in about 5 minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.